He was looking at multiple screens that all said the same thing: the United States had fired. But he didn't pick up the phone, not because he froze, not because the screens were obviously wrong, or because someone told him to wait, and not because he had any certainty at all, that what he was seeing wasn't real. That's the part that makes this story so difficult to tell cleanly. Stanislav Petrov made his decision without knowing whether he was right. He made it in a moment where the evidence pointed one direction, his training pointed in the same direction, and something else, something quieter and harder to define, pointed in another. And it is that quieter signal, not the dramatic act of defiance, that holds the key to understanding what actually happened on the night of September 26, 1983. The story isn't really about one man's courage, not in the way people tell it. It's about a system that can't be trusted, one that had been teaching its operators, through repeated failure, not to trust its own output. And a single night, when that accumulated distrust collided with something almost impossible to describe, the most consequential decision any duty officer had ever been asked to make. Everyone who tells this story says Petrov trusted his gut, but that didn't explain it. What explains it is something colder, something structural. And once you trace it back to where it started, the night of September 26 stops being a miracle. It starts looking like the almost inevitable outcome of a chain of failures that nobody had bothered to fix. Almost the only possible outcome. Not quite. And that gap, the space between almost inevitable and not quite, is where the real story lives. To understand what happened inside Serpukhov 15 on that night, you first need to understand what Serpukhov 15 was. It was a classified military facility located about 130 kilometers south of Moscow, its official designation placing it inside the Soviet Union's nuclear early warning architecture, its existence one of the most closely guarded secrets in the country. Most Soviet citizens had never heard of it and would almost certainly never know it was there. What happened inside it on one night in September 1983 would not reach the outside world for decades. The facility itself was not large by military standards, almost indistinguishable from the outside from the landscape around it. No runway, no missile silos, no visible armament. From the outside, it looked exactly as it was designed to look, almost impossible to single out. Just another installation, almost invisible in the Soviet bureaucratic landscape, indistinguishable from dozens of other classified sites in the region. The power it held had nothing to do with its physical contents, everything to do with the information that flowed through it, the decisions it was built to trigger, and the speed at which those decisions were expected to happen. Inside, a duty officer sat in front of a monitoring station connected to OKO, a satellite network designed to watch for missile launches during their coverage windows. They were placed in orbits designed to view American missile fields near the edge of the Earth and detect launch plumes against the darkness of space. The geometry of those orbits was not accidental. It was dictated by the physics of where Soviet planners expected an American strike to originate and the path it would follow. The flight path was fixed by geometry. An ICBM launched from the U.S. toward Moscow would curve over the North Pole and descend through the Arctic sky, covering the distance in roughly 30 minutes. OKO's satellites were positioned to detect infrared radiation from a missile's plume during boost phase. The earlier the detection, the more time the Soviet command structure had to formulate a response. And in the doctrine of the era, hesitation in that response was impossible. What that form was and how fast it was expected to happen shaped everything about what followed. When a satellite detected that kind of signature, it sent an automated alert to Serpukhov 15, appearing on the duty officer's screens with an unambiguous classification: incoming missile confirmed. And the duty officer's job was not to think about whether that classification was correct. It was to pick up a dedicated phone line and relay the alert to the Soviet command post, quickly, accurately, without hesitation. That was the protocol, the entire chain: satellite detection, automatic flag, human relay, command post confirmation, retaliatory launch, was engineered to execute within minutes. Every second of delay was a second in which incoming warheads drew closer to their targets. Speed was not optional. Delay was impossible. The duty officer was not supposed to be a decision-maker. He was a conduit. The system was designed, deliberately, to compress the human variable down to almost nothing. The logic behind that design was not indifference to human judgment. It was a calculation about what human judgment could realistically accomplish in the time available. In 30 minutes, the window between a launch and its impact, there was no room for deliberation or second opinions. No room for the kind of careful weighing of evidence that might be appropriate in almost any other context. The only thing the system needed was speed. The operator's interpretation didn't matter. Everything else was noise. The human was kept in the loop for one reason only: the technology of the era could not yet replace the relay function entirely. A fully automated chain, from satellite detection directly to launch authorization, was technically possible in concept but not yet achievable in practice. The communication and verification protocols required at least one human hand to pass the signal along. The duty officer was not a safeguard. The system didn't need one. He was a necessary intermediate step in a process that the designers would have automated completely if they could have. Which makes what Petrov did that night almost impossible to understand, unless you know what had been happening to that system for months before he sat down in that chair. The Oko satellites had a problem. Not a rare one. Not an isolated glitch that could be dismissed as an anomaly. A recurring, documented failure mode that the people who maintained the system already knew about and had been unable or unwilling to correct. The problem was sunlight. The satellite's sensors were designed to detect infrared signatures, the heat bloom produced by a rocket engine burning in the upper atmosphere. They were vulnerable to anything else that produced a similar signal. The northern arc wasn't empty space. It was an atmosphere full of clouds. The problem was sunlight striking the tops of high-altitude cloud formations at a particular angle. It could produce an infrared reflection that the satellite sensors struggled to distinguish from an actual missile launch. The reflection wasn't identical to a missile signature, but it was close. Close enough to trigger the alert system. Close enough to produce a classification on the duty officer's screens that said, confirmed, incoming, ballistic missile. The geometry that produced this effect was not random. What mattered was where the sun sat relative to the satellite's orbital path, how dense the cloud layer beneath it was, and the angle at which reflected light entered the sensor array. That's why, when those three variables aligned, and they did, periodically, the satellite would report a ghost, a signal that carried all the formal markers of a missile detection, but corresponded to nothing in the physical world except sunlight and water vapor. The first time this happened, it generated significant alarm. The duty officer on shift followed protocol, relayed the alert, and the command post went to heightened readiness. Hours passed before anyone confirmed it was a false alarm caused by solar interference with the satellite sensors. The sun had fooled the machine. It happened again. Different date. Same mechanism. The geometry aligned, the clouds cooperated, and the satellite produced another ghost signature that looked, on the screens, exactly like an incoming missile. Another false alarm. Another period of elevated alert that resolved into nothing. And again after that. Each time the incident was investigated, each time the cause was traced back to the same optical phenomenon. Each time the technicians documented it and reported it through the appropriate channels. The problem was well understood. It was predictable. The conditions that produced false alarms could be anticipated within a reasonable margin. The people responsible for maintaining the system knew exactly what was causing it. The duty officers who lived through those false alarms carried the experience in a way that no technical report could capture. The first time, the response was pure protocol: relay the alert, wait for confirmation, ride out the hours of uncertainty. The second time, something shifted. The officers began to recognize the shape of the event before it fully resolved. They started noticing the conditions that preceded it, the time of year, the satellite involved, the way the alert arrived on screen. By the third or fourth occurrence, the pattern was not something they had to be told. It was something they felt. An instinct that said, "This one doesn't look right." Not in any way they could have written down clearly enough to satisfy a formal review, but clearly enough to act on if the moment ever demanded it. What they couldn't do was fix it quickly. POC. The solar reflection problem was embedded in the way the satellite's onboard sensors processed incoming light. Correcting it required changes to the detection algorithms. The code that distinguished a missile signature from background noise, and those changes carried risk. Make the correction too aggressive, and a real missile signature might be filtered out. The system could become blind to an actual attack in the process of eliminating false alarms. Make it too conservative, and the ghost signatures would continue. This was a genuine engineering dilemma. How do you fix a system that can't tell sunlight from a missile without risking the ability to detect an actual attack? And it was the kind of dilemma that tends to stall inside large military bureaucracies, particularly when the stakes of getting it wrong in either direction were catastrophic. The technical teams proposed modifications. Some were tested in simulation. But moving from simulation to deployment on active orbital hardware was not a simple step. The satellites were already in orbit. They could not be recalled for maintenance. Any change to their onboard processing had to be uploaded remotely, a process that introduced its own risks of error and that required sign-off from multiple layers of military oversight. Each layer added time and added the possibility that someone in the chain would flag the change as premature or insufficiently tested, or politically sensitive enough to require a higher authority's approval. There was also an institutional incentive not to draw too much attention to the problem. If senior military leadership became fully aware that the ecosystem regularly produced false alarms, it would undermine confidence in the entire early warning architecture. The system's credibility was itself a strategic asset, and in a period of heightened tension, that credibility mattered more than it almost ever had. Admitting its flaws publicly, even internally, was a conversation nobody wanted to have. So the system kept operating with the known flaw intact. The false alarms kept occurring. And the duty officers at Serpukhov My-15 developed an informal, unwritten understanding of when the system could be trusted and when it might be producing noise. This understanding was not part of any manual or protocol. It was accumulated through direct experience. Through sitting in the chair, watching the screens, seeing the alerts come in, and learning, over time, which ones were real and which ones were ghosts. It was the kind of knowledge that lived in a person, not in a document. It could not be transferred by reading a briefing. It could only be acquired by doing the job, shift after shift, and paying close attention to the patterns that the system itself was producing. Petrov was one of those duty officers. He had a background in mathematics and military engineering, the kind of analytical training that made him well-suited to the monitoring role. He had been assigned to Serpukhov 15 for long enough to have worked dozens of shifts in that chair. But the knowledge that mattered most on the night of September 26 was not the kind that came from education. It was the kind that came from repetition, from hundreds of hours in the chair, from watching alerts come in and watching them resolve, from building, over time, a mental model of the system that was more detailed than any official document. A model that included not only how the system was supposed to work, but how it actually worked. The difference between those two things was significant, and by September 1983, he had been accumulating that experience for long enough to have a detailed, intuitive map of the system's failure modes. But intuitive maps are not the same as certainty. This is the distinction that matters most in understanding what happened on September 26. People hear that Petrov knew the system was prone to false alarms and assume he simply recognized the alert as another one and acted on that recognition. That's too clean. The reality was messier. Because the conditions on September 26 were similar to previous false alarms, but not identical. And in a moment where the difference between real attack and system malfunction carried civilizational consequences, that similarity but not identity was enough to introduce genuine doubt into Petrov's mind. He wasn't certain he was looking at a false alarm. He was reasonably confident. But reasonably confident is not the same as certain, and the gap between those two states was where the real danger lived. To understand why that gap was so dangerous on that particular night, you need to understand what was happening in the world around Serpukhov 115. September 26, 1983, fell inside a highly tense period of the Cold War. Not hypothetically, operationally. The two superpowers were among the closest to direct confrontation since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, less than a month before Petrov's shift. On September 1st, Soviet fighter jets had shot down Korean Airlines Flight W7. The civilian airliner had drifted off course and entered Soviet airspace, almost certainly due to a navigation error. The Soviet military intercepted it in the dark, and when the aircraft did not respond, destroyed it. All 269 people aboard were killed. The incident sent shock waves through international diplomacy. The United States condemned it publicly and forcefully. The scale of the response, congressional hearings, diplomatic expulsions, a temporary suspension of satellite communications, reflected how seriously both sides took the event. The Soviet Union's response, initially denial, then a claim that the aircraft had been conducting surveillance, deepened the mistrust between the two governments to a degree that made every subsequent communication feel fragile. Both sides understood that the incident could have escalated further than it did. Neither side was entirely confident that the next incident, whatever form it took, would resolve as cleanly. The atmosphere between Washington and Moscow had shifted from tense to genuinely volatile, and it had done so within the span of a single event. On the American side, the military posture had been escalating for months before that. President Reagan had delivered a speech earlier that year in which he referred to the Soviet Union in unusually confrontational terms. American forces had been conducting exercises near Soviet borders, exercises that Soviet military analysts interpreted as potentially threatening. The exercises were large, loud, and not subtle about the strategic corridors they rehearsed. Soviet intelligence assessments at the time reflected fears that the U.S. might be preparing to strike. Analyses of American military movements, communication patterns, and deployment schedules that, when read together, painted a picture that Soviet planners found genuinely alarming. The early warning infrastructure was placed on heightened readiness. The clock on every shift at Serpukhov 415 was ticking against a backdrop that made every alert feel more urgent than it had before. And the question, the one that every duty officer at Serpukhov 115 was now living inside, was this: what do you do when the screens tell you the war has started? The pressure on duty officers, not to hesitate, not to delay, not to let personal uncertainty slow down the relay chain, had reached a level it had not been at before. Petrov was operating inside that pressure, and when the alert appeared on his screens shortly after midnight, Moscow time, it didn't arrive in isolation. It arrived inside a context that made it harder, not easier, to dismiss. The alert came from the early warning satellite system. The system indicated a high-confidence launch warning from the United States. The alarm was sounding and the screens were lit. The system was behaving exactly as it had been designed to behave. And for anyone who didn't already know what was wrong with it, there was no reason to doubt what it was saying. And Petrov felt something shift. Not panic, not calm, but a kind of sharpened attention that came from two signals arriving at the same time. The first was the alert itself, loud, official, carrying the full authority of the military protocol. The second was quieter. It was a pattern recognition response, built from months of exposure to the system's failure modes. Petrov had reasons to distrust the system's reliability. The time of night, the season, the atmospheric conditions, they fell within the range that had produced false alarms caused by solar interference. Not a perfect match, but close. So Petrov had two competing readings of the same data. The system said, "Missiles are coming." His experience said, "This might be the sun again." For a few seconds, he held both of them in his mind simultaneously. The alarm continued to sound. The screens continued to update. The system was performing exactly as designed, escalating the alert, demanding action, narrowing the window in which a response could be given. Every element of the environment around him was pushing in one direction, and he was standing still. Then more alerts came in. The system registered additional launches, eventually totaling 5. The confirmation was automatic. The system flagged each new warning. The screens updated, and the case for a real attack grew stronger by a measurable degree. This escalation was treated as a serious warning. The evidence had just shifted significantly in favor of the alert being genuine. And Petrov still didn't pick up the phone. This is the moment that requires the closest examination. Because at this point, everything the system was designed to do was pointing toward one conclusion: report the alert. The protocol demanded it. The sensor data supported it. The geopolitical context made it plausible. And the consequences of failing to report, if the attack was real, were total. A duty officer who had been in that position for a shorter period of time, with less accumulated experience of the system's quirks, would almost certainly have followed the protocol. There was no rational basis, none that could be articulated clearly or defended in a subsequent review, for ignoring 3 satellite confirmations of an incoming nuclear strike. But Petrov was not working from articulated reasoning in that moment. He was working from something faster and less conscious than that, a pattern-matching process that had been running continuously since he first sat down in that chair months earlier. And that process had flagged something in the data, something about the way the confirmations were arriving that didn't quite align with what he would have expected if the alerts were tracking actual missiles. The exact nature of that discrepancy has been interpreted differently across various accounts of the incident. Some accounts focus on the timing and pattern of the warnings. Others emphasize the signal characteristics, the way the detected signatures varied across the constellation in ways that were more consistent with an atmospheric optical phenomenon than with the expected infrared signature of real missile launches. Across all accounts, Petrov identified a mismatch. Drawing on his familiarity with the system's failure modes, he saw a deviation. Not proof, not certainty, but a point where the data didn't match what he would have expected if the threat were genuine. In any other context, that kind of mismatch might have been worth investigating further before acting. But Petrov didn't have the luxury of further investigation. The system expected a response, and the clock was running. The longer he waited without relaying the alert, the more his silence itself would become a problem. Not just operationally, but for him personally in any subsequent review of his conduct. He was also watching for something else, for what the satellite data alone could not answer. Throughout the minutes since the first alert, he had been checking the feeds from ground-based radar. These radar systems could detect incoming objects once they rose over the radar horizon, as opposed to infrared shadows that might or might not correspond to anything real. The ground-based radar was reporting nothing. That silence was not, by itself, conclusive. Early-phase missile detection from ground-based radar had limitations. There were windows in the trajectory where the systems might not yet have picked up an incoming warhead. The absence of a radar confirmation didn't definitively mean there were no missiles in the sky, but it didn't support the idea that there were either. And for Petrov, that absence, that quiet absence, was one more data point pulling against the alert. Not enough to be certain, but enough to make the weight of the situation feel less one-sided than it had a minute before. Petrov made the call, not the call to relay the alert. The other one. He contacted the command post and reported that the system was malfunctioning. He said it clearly. He said it with the same authority and cadence that a duty officer would use to report a confirmed strike. Because the chain of command above him was not built to receive hedged assessments. In practice, the process pushed officers toward a binary yes-no assessment. No space for a duty officer to say something like, "I think this might be a false alarm, but I'm not completely sure." Those words didn't exist in the language the system spoke. So Petrov translated his uncertainty into the only format the system could process. He chose the no-threat state, and he stated it as fact. That translation required something that is rarely discussed in accounts of the incident, a willingness to be completely, irrevocably wrong. Most decisions in most contexts allow for correction. You can change your mind. You can hedge. You can wait for more information before committing. Petrov had none of those options. The moment he spoke, the chain above him would act on what he said. If he was wrong, there was no mechanism to undo it. He was not placing a bet that could be adjusted. He was drawing a line, and everything on the other side of that line was out of his control. The danger was absolute. If he was right, if the satellites had been fooled by sunlight and cloud cover, then his call had just prevented the Soviet Union from launching a retaliatory nuclear strike against a country that hadn't attacked it. The consequences of a Soviet strike on the United States in the absence of an American attack would have been catastrophic and immediate. American retaliation could have followed quickly. The war would have started not because of an attack, but because of a misidentification. and Petrov, by staying silent, had closed that door. But only if he was right. If he was wrong, if the missiles were real and the satellites had been tracking an actual American first strike, then Petrov had just told the command post to stand down in the face of nuclear war. He had disabled the early warning chain at the precise moment it was supposed to function. The incoming warheads would continue on their trajectory. The Soviet Union would not retaliate in time. The war would have ended not with mutual destruction, but with one-sided devastation. There was no middle path, no way to hedge, no ability to cover his position. He had committed fully to one reading of the situation, and if that reading was wrong, the error was irreversible. The next 20 minutes were spent in a state of sustained, almost unbearable attention. Petrov continued monitoring every feed available to him. The satellite data kept coming in. The alerts remained active, consistent with what an actual strike would look like in its early phase. The ground-based radar continued to report nothing. And slowly, incrementally, the picture that was forming became consistent with a false alarm rather than an actual attack. He did not relax. Relaxation would have required a level of confidence he did not yet have. What he had instead was a growing asymmetry. The satellite side of the picture was producing data that could be explained by either a real attack or a system malfunction. The ground-based side, by contrast, was producing data that could only be explained by the absence of an actual threat. That asymmetry was not proof. But it was moving in one direction, and only one. Confirmation came as time passed, with no radar corroboration and no impacts, no missiles, no physical objects, nothing crossing the trajectory that the OCO satellites had flagged. The arc was empty. It had been empty the entire time. The system had been fooled by sunlight reflecting off clouds. Sunlight interacting with cloud cover had produced a pattern that mimicked an ICBM signature closely enough to trigger the alert, but not closely enough to represent an actual threat. Petrov had been right. And for a moment, just a moment, something close to relief must have moved through him. Not celebration, not vindication, something quieter. The simple physical fact of having been wrong about nothing. The screens had lied, the arc was clear, and the world was still there. Being right did not protect him. In the hours that followed, the incident was reported and investigated. The Soviet military wanted to understand both the system failure and the duty officer's response to it. Petrov was interviewed. His conduct was reviewed against the protocol he was expected to follow. The question the military was asking was not whether he had saved the world. It was whether he had any right to make that call at all. The outcome was not celebration. The investigation focused not on the result, but on the process. Petrov had overridden a confirmed alert based on personal judgment that the protocol explicitly did not authorize him to exercise. The fact that his judgment had been correct was, from the perspective of the military's institutional logic, almost incidental. The system was designed to remove that kind of discretion from the chain. Petrov had reintroduced it, and there was no category in the system for correct violation. The military was not indifferent to what had happened. Some officials understood, privately, that Petrov's decision had likely prevented a catastrophe. But acknowledging that publicly, or even formally, would have required admitting that the system itself had failed and that the failure was known. The only thing standing between the Soviet Union and a war triggered by its own equipment was an individual officer acting outside his authority. That was not a conclusion any branch of the military wanted on record. He was formally reprimanded, according to multiple accounts, for documentation and logbook issues during the incident. Not harshly, no court-martial, no imprisonment. But the reprimand was enough to alter his career. Petrov did not continue in the same monitoring role. He did not return to the monitoring role at Serpukhov 15. He was not thanked. He was not briefed on the full scope of what his decision had prevented. The military's interest in the incident was not in honoring the outcome, but in containing what it revealed. The technical implications were serious enough on their own, a system that had failed in this way. The institutional implications were worse. An operator who had demonstrated that the chain could be broken from the inside by a single person exercising unauthorized judgment. The incident was classified, and for years, almost no one outside a small circle of Soviet military officials knew it had happened. No details were made public until the 1990s, when former officials and later interviews began to describe the incident. The Petrov incident was among the last to emerge clearly. Later accounts were pieced together over time, and some details remained disputed. And even then, significant details remained disputed or unverified. The story was not handed to the world in a single revelation. It was assembled piece by piece from a bureaucracy that had spent years ensuring it would not be understood. Eventually, Petrov himself began to speak about what had happened, first cautiously, then with increasing openness as the years passed and the political context that had kept him silent no longer existed. When the international community finally grasped the scale of what had occurred on September 26, 1983, the reaction was dramatic. The false alarm created a serious risk of catastrophic escalation. Petrov was called a hero. Awards were given. His story was told and retold in books, documentaries, and eventually films. And Petrov's response to all of that attention was consistent across years of interviews in a way that revealed more about the experience than any dramatization could. He said he didn't feel like a hero. He said he had been doing his job. In interviews, Petrov downplayed the idea of being a hero. The exception was not Petrov. The exception was the circumstances that put a man with that particular depth of knowledge in that particular chair on that particular night. That answer is not modesty. It's precision. From the inside. From Petrov's own experience of that night, the decision didn't feel like heroism. It didn't feel like defiance or moral clarity or transcended courage. It felt like noticing that a machine was behaving in a way he had seen before and responding to that observation the way his experience told him to respond. The fact that the machine happened to be part of the nuclear defense apparatus changed the magnitude of the moment, but not its texture. And that thread connects back to the very beginning. We started with a man looking at screens that said the world was ending, and we asked, why didn't he do anything? Not because he was braver than the system expected. Not because he had some moral clarity that rose above his training and his country and the weight of the moment. He didn't act, or rather, he acted by not acting. Because the system he was operating inside had spent months teaching him exactly when not to trust its output. It had done that not through any deliberate instruction, but through repeated failure, through known reliability issues and the possibility of false alarms that the duty officers learned to recognize through direct exposure rather than through any protocol or manual. Petrov didn't break the system on September 26. The system had already broken itself, quietly, incrementally, in a way that was known to the people who maintained it, but never publicly acknowledged or corrected. What Petrov did was notice, and he acted on that observation in a moment when acting on it was the only thing standing between the Soviet Union and a war that neither side actually wanted. Put a different officer in that chair, someone newer, with less exposure to the system's specific failure modes, and the outcome that night might have been different. The protocol would have been followed. The alert would have been relayed. and the Soviet command post would have received a confirmed report of an American nuclear strike that never happened. What would have followed is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. Soviet planning emphasized assured retaliation, but how quickly leaders would have acted on warning data alone remains debated. The political context of late 1983, with its heightened tensions and mutual suspicion, made a launch authorization more likely, not less. Whether the leadership would have authorized one based solely on satellite confirmation, without ground-based radar corroboration, is unknowable. The doctrine supported it. The atmosphere of the moment made it plausible. And even if the Soviet leadership had hesitated, even if some voice in the command structure had counseled restraint, the pressure of the situation would have been working against that restraint every second. 20 minutes is not enough time for diplomacy. It is barely enough time for a phone call. The system was not designed to accommodate doubt at the top. It was designed to compress the entire process, from detection to launch, into a window so short that doubt itself became a strategic liability. What is certain is that Petrov's intervention removed the question entirely. By the time the command post received his assessment, system malfunction, no threat. The chain had been broken, and the 20 minutes that followed allowed ground-based radar to confirm Petrov's own conclusion. There were no missiles. But the deeper lesson of the night was not about Petrov. It was about the system. A defense architecture designed to protect a nation from nuclear annihilation had, through a known and unrepaired flaw, come close to causing the very catastrophe it was built to prevent. The system had not been defeated by an enemy. It had not been hacked or sabotaged or penetrated by a foreign intelligence operation. It had been fooled by sunlight, by the ordinary, predictable, well-understood interaction of light and cloud cover. And the only thing that had stood between that flaw and its worst possible consequence was one man's accumulated familiarity with its behavior. Familiarity that existed nowhere in any official record. The world didn't end on September 26, 1983. It came close. One of the more dangerous moments of the Cold War. And the reason it didn't comes down to a set of circumstances that had very little to do with planning or design or the wisdom of any particular leader. It comes down to a flaw in a satellite system that nobody fixed. To an informal body of knowledge that accumulated in the minds of duty officers who were never asked to document it. To one man who happened to be sitting in the right chair with the right depth of experience at the right moment. And to a decision made not from heroism, but from something quieter, from years of paying attention to a machine that had, without meaning to, taught him exactly how it failed. The screen said, "The world was ending." Petrov said, "I've seen this before, and this isn't it." He was right. But he didn't have to be. And that contingency, that thin, improbable thread connecting one man's accumulated experience to the survival of everything, is the part of the story that should stay with you long after the rest of it fades. It is not a story about a hero. It is not a story about a system working as intended. It is a story about a system failing in a way that was known, documented, and left unfixed. It is a story about the narrow, accidental margin by which that failure did not become the most consequential event in human history. The margin was not wide. It was not engineered. It was not the product of any deliberate policy or institutional wisdom. It was the product of one man's proximity to a machine he understood better than the people who built it. Not the heroism, the fragility,